I'm the Director of Instructional Strategy for Schoology, and today I want to talk a little bit about change and one possible reason why implementations or initiatives may fail at an organizational level. When I was doing some work in my previous district around equity, one of the things that our leadership brought up was some of the concepts that you find in these works by Ron Heifetz and Marty Linsky, specifically on the adaptive leadership ideas that are behind diagnosing technical challenges versus adaptive challenges. And there are a lot of things that are in the work of Linsky and Heifetz that I think are really relevant for what we do in education. These were obviously out of the business world, but there's a lot I think that's applicable for us because ultimately we're all dealing with change. So one of the quotations that kind of struck me as I read through some of the material from Linsky and Heifetz was this idea about what happens with common failures from leadership. And this idea that sometimes if leadership doesn't identify the right type of challenge and they approach it as a technical challenge versus an adaptive one, it can actually lead to failure not only for the initiative itself, but for any long-term change that they want to see happening in their organization. So how do you diagnose those? How do you know whether or not what you're dealing with is a technical challenge or an adaptive one? So a technical challenge is very clearly defined. It's one that can typically be solved by experts. It can be resolved in short time spans with kind of short-term gains. It can be issued by edict or decree from leadership or from an authority. It's actually solved by those in authority or leadership, or maybe even a committee or a group of delegates who carry out that change. And the learning it requires tends to be informative, but the basic perceptions about and attitudes about life, about work, about approaches, those basically remain the same. And then finally, you tend to see less resistance when you're dealing with a technical challenge. So examples that Heifetz brought up, he liked to use medical terms a lot, or medical analogies. So if you break your leg, obviously, that's a clearly defined problem. It's solved by a doctor. You have the cast on. Typically, you don't resist that. It's basically nothing that requires you to change anything about your health habits, except maybe, if it was something that was like a risky behavior. Basically, the leg is going to heal itself in time, and you'll be sort of back to normal. So that would be a technical challenge. In the educational side, I would say, thinking back on my experience, there was a point when we needed to change email systems from one email system to another. So again, a very clearly defined challenge. There was some learning involved, but it really was more understanding maybe some subtle differences in the way the programs worked. Fundamentally, people's beliefs about email did not change. If we're looking at adaptive challenges, on the other hand, we have kind of a different set of things that happen in terms of the way those are approached. So adaptive challenges are harder to define. So you might have an initiative like going with blended learning. Or maybe if we go back to that physical example or the medical example, you might have a situation where you have a multitude of symptoms that are leading you to not be healthy. It might be maybe it's high blood pressure, maybe it's being overweight, or something that has maybe multiple causes that are kind of contributing together. And the thing about adaptive challenge is that your stakeholders are the ones that actually have to solve that problem. It can't be from the expert. So in the case of the doctor coming in, the doctor can prescribe something for you and can give you a diet and whatever else, but the person that has to actually make the change is the patient, not the doctor. The doctor cannot do that for the patient. And the same thing would be true if we're talking about blended learning, or if we're talking about something like adopting a learning management system so that you can do blended learning. The people that are going to be using that system, they're the ones that have to make those adjustments into their workflow. So you tend to have longer-term outcomes because it tends to be complicated and it has a lot of moving parts. And probably the biggest thing for me is that adaptive challenge requires changes in attitude, beliefs, and behaviors. That's huge. And that's part of the reason why adaptive challenges are so, in some cases, frustrating, because there are so many things that have to happen to get people to change the way they feel. This is a much more emotional kind of a challenge than a technical one. Typically requires collaboration with those stakeholders, and if you're dealing with something that is both has a technical aspect to it and an adaptive aspect, It's collaboration between your leadership and your stakeholders because they all have to be involved in making that change happen or making things work. The learning required tends to be transformative. So because that results in those shifts in perceptions, you have to transform the way you think about things, the way you perceive things. But because of that, you tend to face more resistance. So as you're down this road of change and as you're looking at this as a leader, how do you then kind of tackle this idea? What do you need to think about when you're planning and thinking about how you want to frame that change for people? Well, one of the things you have to do is think about what you're going to stop doing. In our case, when we adopted Schoology, because we're going really for a blended learning kind of idea, and this idea that anytime, anywhere, any learner, any device could happen in all of our classrooms, we had to think about what we could stop doing and what we needed to stop doing. And in our case, it was things like assuming that the materials we are purchasing are in print. We need to stop looking at print resources as our exclusive way to deliver content and curriculum and think about other ways that that can happen. And we also need to stop thinking about school and learning as only happening between a certain time frame during the day. That we needed to think about learning happening in a much broader time frame. And we also need to stop thinking about learners being kind of stuck with maybe one pace, for example. We wanted to think about how do we really make that more relevant for kids so that they're having an experience that's really kind of better tailored for them and their needs. So you need to think about what you're going to stop doing. You also need to think about what you're going to continue to do, because just because you're making a change doesn't mean that everything has to stop. There are things that will be valuable in your culture, in your practices, in your beliefs that need to stay. So maybe what we need to keep doing is we still need to keep believing in that growth mindset and that all kids can learn. Maybe we still need to think about the way that we differentiate. We still need to think about the way that we pace and structure learning. So that those things will continue. And then also, we need to think about what are we building. So we're going to stop some things, we're going to continue some things, but what new construct are we going to have as a result of that challenge, of that adaptive change? Again, I'm Kellie Ady. If you have suggestions, ideas, comments, feel free to reach out to us on social media or tweet us at Schoology.